Experience the intimate world of the Library of Alexandria, the night before the flame, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The late afternoon sun cast its familiar geometry across the marble floors of the great library's cataloging hall, creating those amber pools of light that Demetrius had watched shift and fade for 37 years. The dust motes danced in the slanted beams with their eternal, unhurried ballet, and somewhere in the building's depths, the gentle murmur of scholars at work provided a constant, reassuring backdrop to his thoughts. This was the hour he loved most, when the day's urgent consultations had ended and the evening's contemplative reading had not yet begun, when the library belonged most completely to those who tended it rather than those who merely used it. He moved between the towering cedar shelves with the measured pace of ritual, his arthritic fingers trailing along the labeled scroll cases in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Aristotle's Ethics, worn smooth by countless hands, the Republic, its papyrus darkened with age, the Stoic commentaries, arranged not by author, but by the particular shade of philosophical inquiry they pursued. Each touch was a small benediction, a confirmation that these thoughts, these carefully preserved arguments and insights, remained exactly where they should be, exactly where they had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. The familiar ritual soothed something in him that words could not reach. Here, in the philosophy section where he had begun his work as a young man barely past 20, the order he had helped create and maintain felt as solid as the marble beneath his feet. The scrolls sat in their designated places like old friends at a dinner table, each one known not just by its contents, but by the particular way the papyrus had aged, the small tears that marked years of careful handling, the fading of ink that spoke of countless readings under oil lamp light. Yet today, as his fingers moved along the familiar spines, something indefinable troubled the edges of his consciousness. It was nothing he could name, nothing that showed itself in the physical arrangement of the collection or the behavior of his colleagues. The young scribes worked with their usual dedication in the copying chambers. The scholars pursued their research with the same passionate intensity that had always marked the library's atmosphere. The evening light fell through the great windows in precisely the patterns he expected, creating those geometric shadows on the polished floor that had become as much a part of his daily experience as the taste of morning bread. But beneath the surface of routine, something stirred. Perhaps it was nothing more than the weight of years, the way a man past 60 begins to feel the fragility of all human arrangements, no matter how solid they appear. Perhaps it was the particular quality of light today, or the way the distant murmur of conversation seemed to carry a different undertone, barely perceptible, but somehow changed. He paused at a gap where a scroll should be, frowning slightly as he tried to recall who had consulted it last. Apollodorus, perhaps, working on his commentary on Plato's mathematics. Or young Nicias, whose enthusiasm for pre-Socratic philosophy sometimes led him to keep texts longer than the library's careful scheduling allowed. The gap bothered him more than it should have. In 37 years, he had seen thousands of such temporary absences, scrolls borrowed and returned, consulted and replaced, the natural circulation that kept knowledge alive rather than merely preserved. But today, the empty space seemed to carry weight, to suggest something more permanent than a scholar's temporary need. He made a mental note to check the borrowing records, though he knew he would likely forget by morning, absorbed as he always was in the day's immediate demands. Moving deeper into the philosophy collection, he found himself pausing more frequently, his hands lingering on particular scrolls, as if to reassure himself of their continued presence. Here was the complete works of Democritus, copied from texts that had already been ancient when the library was founded. Here were the fragments of Heraclitus, their cryptic wisdom preserved in the careful Greek of Alexandria's finest scribes. Each text represented not just the thoughts of its author, but the accumulated labor of generations of scholars who had deemed these ideas worth preserving, worth the expense of papyrus and ink, worth the countless hours required to copy and recopy as the original materials aged beyond use. The light was fading now, the amber pools on the floor growing dimmer and more diffuse. Soon the evening lamps would be lit, and the library would take on its nighttime character, quieter but no less alive, filled with the particular intensity of scholars who preferred to work in the gentle circle of lamplight rather than the broader illumination of day. Demetrius loved these evening hours, when the great hall settled into a more intimate scale, when conversations were conducted in lower voices and the scratch of reed pens on papyrus became more audible in the gathering quiet. As he completed his circuit of the philosophy section, checking the last few shelves where the more esoteric texts resided, he found his unease beginning to settle. The familiar routine had worked its usual magic, reminding him that some things endured, that the careful order he and his predecessors had built here was stronger than whatever vague anxieties might trouble an aging librarian's mind. Tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same quiet satisfactions, the same sense of participating in something larger and more lasting than any individual life. Yet, as he prepared to move on to the evening's other duties, to check the copying chambers and ensure the lamps were properly trimmed for the night's work, the feeling lingered at the edges of his consciousness. Not fear exactly, but a kind of heightened awareness, as if the very air of the library had become more precious, more worthy of attention. He stood for a moment longer in the gathering dusk, listening to the gentle murmur of distant voices, feeling the weight of all those carefully preserved thoughts surrounding him like a benevolent presence, and tried to name what it was that made this ordinary evening feel somehow different from all the others that had come before. The marble beneath his feet held the day's warmth, releasing it slowly into the cooling air in a way that reminded him of how the library itself seemed to breathe with accumulated knowledge. Each stone had been placed with the same careful attention to permanence that governed the arrangement of texts, creating a foundation that would outlast the lives of all who worked here. The thought brought him comfort, this sense of being part of something that transcended individual mortality, something that would continue its quiet work of preservation long after his own hands had grown too stiff to handle the precious scrolls. He thought of the young scribes in their chambers, bent over their copying work with the same dedication he had brought to his tasks 4 decades ago. They would grow old here as he had, would come to know each text not just by its contents, but by the particular feel of its papyrus, the way its edges had been worn by handling, the small stains and marks that told the story of its consultation over the years. They would develop their own rituals of care, their own ways of moving through the collection that would become as natural as walking, their own deep satisfaction in the work of preservation that required no justification beyond itself. The distant murmur of scholarly conversation continued, a sound that had provided the backdrop to his working life for so long, that he rarely noticed it consciously. But now, in this moment of heightened awareness, he heard it as if for the first time. The gentle rise and fall of voices engaged in the eternal human project of trying to understand, the particular tone that marked serious intellectual inquiry, the quiet passion that drove men to spend their lives in pursuit of knowledge that might benefit generations yet unborn. It was a sound that connected this place to the great tradition of learning that stretched back to the earliest attempts to record human thought and forward to whatever future awaited the preservation of wisdom. As the evening shadows deepened around the towering shelves, Demetrius found himself thinking about the particular form of immortality that books provided. The philosophers whose works surrounded him had been dead for centuries, their bodies long since returned to dust, but their thoughts lived on in these carefully preserved texts, as vivid and immediate as the day they were first set down. In tending these scrolls, he participated in a form of resurrection, keeping alive the voices of the past so that they might continue to speak to the future. The responsibility of this work had never felt heavier or more precious than it did in this moment of gathering twilight, when the library seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of another night of quiet preservation. In the small copying chamber adjacent to the main hall, where the evening light from the harbor window fell in a gentle slant across her wooden desk, Thalia worked with the absorbed concentration that had marked her craft since childhood. The distant sound of waves against the harbor wall provided a constant, barely audible rhythm to her work, a natural percussion that seemed to match the careful movement of her reed pen across the papyrus. This was her favorite hour for copying, when the day's heat had passed and the evening air carried the salt scent of the Mediterranean through her window, mingling with the familiar aromas of ink and parchment that defined her working life. The astronomical treatise spread before her had become as familiar as her own thoughts over the weeks she had spent transcribing it. Each word emerged from her pen with the precision that came from deep understanding, for she had long ago moved beyond mere mechanical copying to something approaching communion with the text itself. The author's careful observations of planetary movements, his mathematical calculations of celestial distances, his theories about the nature of the cosmos, all of this had passed through her mind and hand so many times that she could recite entire passages from memory. Her reed pen moved with practiced grace, forming each letter with the particular care that distinguished the work of Alexandria's finest scribes. The curve of an omega flowing like water from the pen's tip, the precise angles of a delta, each line meeting its neighbor at exactly the proper point. The careful spacing that allowed the eye to move easily from word to word, from line to line, carrying the reader forward through the author's argument without the distraction of cramped or careless letter forms. This was more than writing. It was a form of meditation, a way of thinking with the hand as much as with the mind. When she paused to trim her pen, cutting the reed at just the angle that would produce the cleanest lines, the silence in her small chamber felt sacred. Through the window, she could see the harbor where ships from across the Mediterranean brought scholars and texts to the library, where merchants and philosophers mingled in the cosmopolitan atmosphere that made Alexandria the intellectual center of the world. But here, in this intimate space where she spent her days in dialogue with the greatest minds of the past, the larger world seemed both very distant and immediately present, filtered through the lens of the knowledge she helped preserve. The oil lamp flickered slightly, casting her shadow large against the wall, and she adjusted the wick with the unconscious care of someone who lived by such light. The flame steadied, returning the room to its proper illumination, and she bent again to her work. The passage she was copying dealt with the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon the author had observed through decades of careful measurement. As her pen formed the Greek letters that described this cosmic dance, Thalia felt herself participating in something that stretched from the ancient observations recorded in Babylon to the future scholars who would consult this copy long after her own hand had stilled. The wooden desk beneath her hands was worn smooth by countless scribes who had worked at this same station, their dedication wearing away the wood's roughness until it felt almost alive under her palms. In the ceramic holder beside her inkpot, reed pens of various cuts waited their turn, each one prepared for a specific type of work. Fine pens for detailed mathematical notation, broader ones for headings and emphasis, special pens kept sharp for the most delicate corrections. The tools of her trade surrounded her like old friends, each one shaped by use to fit perfectly in her hand. As the evening deepened and the harbor sounds grew quieter, Thalia found herself moving into that state of complete absorption that marked her best work. The words flowed from the original text through her eyes and mind to her hand without conscious intervention, as if she had become a transparent medium through which ancient wisdom passed into new form. She was no longer copying. She was participating in the eternal conversation between past and future, adding her own careful contribution to the chain of preservation that kept human knowledge alive. The particular metallic scent of ink mingled with the salt air from the harbor, creating an atmosphere that she had come to associate with the deepest satisfaction her work could provide. Here, in this small chamber where the day's urgent business never intruded, where the only sounds were the whisper of papyrus and the distant rhythm of waves, she had found a form of peace that required no explanation or justification. The work itself was enough. The careful formation of letters, the preservation of ideas, the quiet pride that came from knowing that her skill served something larger than herself. When she reached the end of a particularly complex passage dealing with lunar calculations, she allowed herself a moment of rest, flexing her cramped fingers and looking out at the harbor where the evening light was beginning to fade. A few late ships were making their way into port, their sails dark against the sunset sky, carrying perhaps new texts for the library's collection, or scholars eager to consult the treasures already preserved here. The sight filled her with a quiet happiness, a sense of belonging to something that connected her, not just to this place and time, but to the larger human project of understanding the world and preserving that understanding for future generations. Returning to her work, she began a new section of the treatise, one that dealt with the author's speculations about the possibility of other worlds beyond the sphere of fixed stars. As her pen formed the words that expressed such vast imaginative leaps, Thalia felt the particular intimacy that came from knowing a text more deeply than casual readers ever could. She knew not just what the author said, but how he said it, the rhythm of his prose, the particular Greek constructions he favored, the way his mind moved from observation to theory to speculation. In copying his work, she had become his most attentive reader, his most faithful interpreter, the guardian of nuances that might be lost to less careful attention. The gentle sound of waves against the harbor wall seemed to deepen as the evening progressed, becoming not just background to her work, but an integral part of the rhythm that governed her copying. Each stroke of her pen seemed to match the eternal pulse of water against stone, creating a harmony between her human craft and the natural world that surrounded the library. This connection to something larger than herself had always been part of what drew her to scribal work, this sense that in preserving knowledge she participated in patterns as ancient and enduring as the tides themselves. She thought of her teacher in Athens, the elderly scribe who had first shown her how to cut a reed pen properly, how to mix ink to exactly the right consistency, how to space letters so that they formed not just words, but visual harmonies on the page. He had spoken often of the scribe's responsibility to the future, the way each copied text became a bridge across time, carrying the thoughts of the past to readers not yet born. Now, working in the great library where texts from across the known world gathered like tributaries flowing into a vast river of knowledge, she understood what he had meant. The chamber grew quieter as the harbor settled into its evening rhythm, the sounds of commerce and navigation giving way to the gentler activities of night. Through her window, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that the astronomer whose work she copied had observed centuries ago from some distant city, recording their movements with the same careful attention she now brought to preserving his observations. The continuity of this work, this chain of observation and preservation that connected past and future through the medium of carefully formed letters, filled her with a satisfaction that needed no external validation. As she prepared to begin another section of the treatise, one dealing with the mathematical relationships between planetary orbits, Thalia found herself thinking about the particular form of immortality that scribal work provided. The astronomer, whose observations she copied, had been dead for generations, his name known now only to scholars, but his understanding of the cosmos lived on in these pages, as fresh and immediate as if he had just completed his calculations. In copying his work with perfect fidelity, she ensured that his insights would continue to illuminate the minds of future students, that his contribution to human understanding would survive the decay of his mortal body. The geography wing of the great library occupied the building's eastern corner, where the morning sun would illuminate the great consultation table, and the evening light now fell in gentle rectangles across the organized array of map cylinders that lined the walls. Marcus moved through this space with the methodical precision that had marked his work for 20 years, the soft whisper of his sandals on marble providing the only counterpoint to the deeper silence that seemed to gather in this particular corner of the library as day faded into night. Here, surrounded by humanity's accumulated knowledge of the world's shape and extent, he found a peace that had nothing to do with the philosophical consolation sought in other wings of the building, and everything to do with the simple satisfaction of order maintained and knowledge properly preserved. The great chart of the Mediterranean, consulted that day by a merchant planning trade routes to Gaul, lay spread across the consultation table like a captured piece of the world itself. Marcus approached it with the careful attention he brought to all the maps in his care, noting how the papyrus had aged since his last close examination, how the pigments used to mark coastlines and cities had faded or darkened with time. This particular map was old, perhaps copied from charts that had guided Phoenician traders centuries before Alexandria was founded, and it carried in its carefully drawn coastlines the accumulated knowledge of countless navigators who had risked their lives to determine exactly where land met sea. As he began to roll the chart, his movements were deliberate and gentle, the gestures of someone who understood that he held not just papyrus and ink, but the distilled experience of human exploration. Each curve of coastline represented voyages undertaken, storms weathered, harbors discovered. the small notations in various hands, wind patterns, seasonal variations, notes about tides and currents, spoke of practical knowledge earned through direct encounter with the world's dangers and mysteries. Rolling the map was like gathering up all those individual acts of courage and curiosity into a form that could be preserved and consulted by future generations of travelers. The designated cylinder for Mediterranean charts stood ready, its cedar wood darkened with age and handling, its bronze fittings green with the patina that spoke of decades in the library's carefully maintained environment. Marcus slid the rolled chart into its proper place, ensuring that the identifying label faced outward where future consultants could easily find it. The system he had inherited and refined over his years as keeper of geographical texts was more than mere organization. It was a form of intellectual architecture that allowed the accumulated spatial knowledge of the civilized world to be accessed with efficiency and precision. The room grew darker as he worked, but Marcus knew this space so well that he could have continued his tasks in complete darkness. Each map cylinder had its designated position, determined not just by geographical region, but by date of creation, accuracy of information, and frequency of consultation. The charts of Egypt and the Nile Delta, consulted almost daily by merchants and administrators, occupied the most accessible positions. The speculative maps of distant lands, India, the mysterious regions beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the rumored continents of the far south, resided in higher positions, consulted less frequently, but preserved with equal care against the day when their information might prove valuable. Moving to the section devoted to overland routes, Marcus began organizing the day's consulted materials with the same methodical attention. A chart showing the roads between Alexandria and Rome, marked with distances and way stations, a detailed plan of the caravan routes that crossed the Syrian desert, annotated with information about water sources and seasonal hazards. A map of the Nile's upper reaches, where the river's course became uncertain and the cartographer's art gave way to informed speculation based on travelers' reports and local knowledge. Each map told its own story of human curiosity and determination, of the drive to understand and chart the world's extent that had led explorers to venture into unknown territories with nothing but courage and crude instruments to guide them. As Marcus handled these records of exploration, he felt himself connected to that larger project of understanding that had drawn him to geographical studies in the first place. Here was knowledge that had been earned rather than merely reasoned, understanding that came from direct encounter with the world's complexity rather than from philosophical speculation. The particular dry smell of old papyrus and geographical pigments filled the evening air of the wing, a scent that Marcus had come to associate with the deepest satisfactions his work could provide. Unlike the philosophical texts that dominated other sections of the library, maps carried their authority not from the reputation of their creators, but from their correspondence to physical reality. A map was either accurate or it was not. A route either led to its intended destination or it led astray. This directness, this immediate connection between knowledge and practical application, appealed to something in Marcus's temperament that found philosophical abstractions less compelling than concrete information about the world's actual structure. As the shadows lengthened across the organized chaos of human exploration recorded on parchment, Marcus found himself thinking about the particular form of immortality that geographical knowledge possessed. Philosophers might argue endlessly about the nature of reality, but an accurately drawn coastline would guide ships safely to harbor long after its creator's name had been forgotten. The anonymous navigators and surveyors whose work filled these cylinders had achieved a form of lasting contribution to human welfare that required no elaborate theoretical framework, no complex argumentation, no defense against rival schools of thought. Completing his evening routine, Marcus surveyed the geography wing with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that everything was in its proper place, ready for tomorrow's consultations. The maps and charts that surrounded him represented humanity's growing understanding of the world's physical structure, a form of knowledge that accumulated steadily over time rather than cycling through the endless debates that marked other forms of intellectual inquiry. Here, in this corner of the library devoted to practical rather than theoretical knowledge, he had found his proper place in the larger project of human understanding. The evening light continued to fade, casting longer shadows between the map cylinders and creating an atmosphere of deepening contemplation that Marcus had come to treasure. This was the hour when the geography wing felt most like a sanctuary, when the practical concerns of merchants and administrators gave way to something more meditative, more connected to the wonder that had originally driven human beings to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of home. In this gathering darkness, surrounded by the accumulated records of human exploration, he felt himself part of a tradition that stretched back to the first curious travelers who had ventured beyond their tribal territories and forward to future explorers who would push the boundaries of the known world ever further. He thought of the Roman engineers whose precise surveys had made possible the great roads that connected the empire, their careful measurements preserved in the charts that occupied an entire section of his collection. He thought of the Greek navigators who had ventured into the Black Sea and beyond the Pillars of Hercules, recording their discoveries in the coastal charts that had guided subsequent generations of traders and colonists. He thought of the anonymous Arab merchants whose knowledge of caravan routes across the great deserts had been carefully preserved in the maps that now helped other travelers avoid the dangers of waterless wastes and shifting sands. All of these individual contributions to human knowledge of the world's geography had found their way to this quiet corner of the great library, where they were preserved not as monuments to their creator's fame, but as practical tools for future use. The democratic nature of this knowledge appealed to Marcus's Roman sensibilities. Here was information that served the common good rather than the glory of individual philosophers or the interests of particular schools of thought. A map that accurately showed the location of a safe harbor served every sailor who consulted it, regardless of his philosophical beliefs or cultural background. As he prepared to light the evening lamps that would allow him to complete his cataloging work, Marcus found himself thinking about the peculiar relationship between knowledge and territory that his work embodied. The maps and charts that surrounded him were more than mere records of exploration. They were instruments of possession, ways of claiming intellectual ownership of the world's physical structure. Yet, unlike other forms of possession, geographical knowledge grew more valuable when shared, more useful when widely distributed. A secret map was of little use to anyone, a map that guided many travelers safely to their destinations, served the cause of human flourishing in ways that transcended individual benefit. The soft whisper of his sandals on marble continued to provide the only sound in the geography wing as he moved between the map cylinders, each step part of the rhythm that had governed his working life for 2 decades. This quiet, methodical progress through the collection had become a form of meditation for him, a way of connecting with the larger patterns of human exploration and discovery that the maps represented. In tending these records of humanity's growing knowledge of the world, he participated in something that was both intensely practical and mysteriously spiritual: the ancient human drive to understand the shape and extent of the world that contained all human experience. The communal dining area for the library's resident scholars occupied a long, low-ceilinged room that opened onto a small courtyard where evening air moved gently through olive trees, carrying with it the mingled scents of the harbor and the city beyond. Helena sat at one of the simple wooden tables, breaking her bread slowly as the familiar voices of her colleagues created the comfortable backdrop of intellectual community that had become, over the years, as necessary to her well-being as food or sleep. The warm light of multiple oil lamps cast a golden glow over the gathering, softening the angular features of faces she had come to know as well as those of family, creating an atmosphere of intimate communion that made the larger world seem both very distant and immediately present. Old Apollodorus was engaged in one of his gentle arguments with young Nicias, their voices carrying the particular tone of philosophical discussion that never quite became heated, never lost the underlying affection that marked true intellectual friendship. Tonight, they were debating Plato's allegory of the cave, a conversation Helena had heard them conduct, with variations, dozens of times over the years, but she never tired of listening to the way their minds worked through familiar problems, finding new angles of approach, discovering fresh implications in ideas that had been examined by countless generations of thinkers. The bread in her hands was coarse and honest, made from grain that had grown in the fertile fields along the Nile, and she savored both its simple nourishment and the way it connected her to the larger community that sustained the library's work. The wine, watered in the Greek fashion, carried the taste of grapes that had ripened under the Mediterranean sun. The olives were local, their oil rich with the flavor of Alexandria's particular soil and climate. Even the cheese, brought from goats that grazed in the hills near Memphis, spoke of the network of relationships that made their scholarly community possible. As she ate, Helena found herself studying the faces around her in the lamplight, these people who had become her family through shared devotion to ideas that would outlive them all. There was Marcus, the keeper of geographical texts, methodical and precise, even in the way he ate his evening meal. Thalia, the young scribe whose dedication to her craft had earned the respect of scholars twice her age. Demetrius, the head librarian, whose quiet authority had shaped the library's character for more than 3 decades. Each face told its own story of intellectual passion, of lives shaped by the pursuit of understanding rather than more conventional forms of success. The conversation flowed around her like a gentle current, touching on questions that had occupied human minds since thinking began: the nature of justice, the relationship between knowledge and virtue, the possibility of understanding the divine through reason. These were not abstract problems for the people gathered in this room. They were the living questions that gave shape and meaning to their daily work, the intellectual challenges that made their scholarly labors feel like participation in something larger than individual ambition or curiosity. Helena half listened to the familiar debate, allowing her mind to drift in the way that evening conversations permitted, following connections and associations that the day's more focused work did not allow. She thought about the Epicurean texts she had been studying, their emphasis on the simple pleasures that made life worth living. Here, in this modest room where bread and wine were shared among friends, where ideas moved freely from mind to mind, where the lamplight created a circle of warmth against the gathering darkness, she found a perfect illustration of the philosopher's teaching about the nature of happiness. The evening air that moved through the open windows carried sounds from the city beyond the library's walls. The distant calls of merchants closing their stalls, the murmur of conversation from taverns and private homes, the occasional bark of a dog or cry of a child. These sounds reminded her that the scholarly community gathered here existed within a larger human context, that their work of preserving and interpreting the wisdom of the past served not just their own intellectual needs, but the broader project of human understanding that connected them to people they would never meet in times they would never see. As the meal progressed and the conversation continued its meandering course through familiar territory, Helena felt the particular melancholy that came from recognizing how precious and fragile such moments were. The community gathered in this room represented something rare in human experience. A group of people brought together not by family ties or economic necessity, but by shared commitment to ideas and the preservation of knowledge. They had created, through years of daily interaction, a form of intellectual fellowship that required no formal structure, no external validation, no reward beyond the satisfaction of participating in conversations that mattered. Watching Apollodorus gesture as he made a point about the relationship between appearance and reality, seeing the way Nicias leaned forward with the eager attention of someone genuinely engaged with ideas, Helena understood that she was witnessing something that existed nowhere else in quite this form. The library provided not just a repository for texts, but a living community where ancient wisdom continued to breathe and grow through the minds of people who had devoted their lives to understanding. The moment felt both eternal, as if such conversations had always taken place and always would, and impossibly fragile, dependent on circumstances that could change without warning. The lamps burned lower as the evening advanced, their flames creating smaller circles of light that drew the group closer together, making their voices more intimate, their gestures more significant. In this atmosphere of gentle communion, where bread and ideas were shared with equal generosity, Helena found herself thinking that this might be what the philosophers meant when they wrote about the good life, not the pursuit of pleasure or the accumulation of honors, but the simple satisfaction of belonging to a community where minds could meet in genuine friendship, where the ancient questions could be examined once more by people who cared enough to seek understanding rather than merely victory in argument. The courtyard beyond the windows had grown darker now, the olive trees becoming shadowy forms against the star-filled sky, but their presence remained constant, a gentle reminder of the natural world that surrounded and sustained this human gathering. The air that moved through their branches carried the coolness of approaching night, a subtle shift in temperature that made the warmth of the dining room feel more precious, more intentional. Helena pulled her light shawl closer around her shoulders, not from cold, but from a desire to mark this transition, to acknowledge the way evening transformed even familiar spaces into something slightly different, more intimate, more conducive to the kind of quiet reflection that came naturally at day's end. She watched Thalia carefully copying something into a small notebook, probably a phrase or idea that had emerged from the evening's discussion. and Helena remembered her own early years at the library, when every conversation had seemed to contain revelations, when the simple act of listening to experienced scholars debate ancient questions had felt like being admitted to mysteries that few people would ever encounter. Now, after decades of such evenings, she understood that the real mystery was not in any particular insight or conclusion, but in the way human minds could meet across centuries, how ideas could create bridges between people who shared nothing but curiosity and the willingness to think carefully about questions that had no easy answers. The wine in her cup had grown warm, taking on the temperature of the room, of her hands, of the evening itself. She sipped it slowly, tasting not just the grapes, but the entire context of this moment, the lamplight playing across wooden tables worn smooth by years of use, the comfortable weight of books that lined the walls even here in the dining area, the way voices rose and fell in the natural rhythm of conversation among people who had learned to listen as carefully as they spoke. This was what Epicurus had meant, she thought, when he wrote about the pleasure of friendship, the satisfaction of simple needs met in the company of people whose presence enhanced, rather than diminished, one's sense of being fully alive. Marcus had begun telling a story about a manuscript he had discovered that morning, a text that challenged conventional understanding of trade routes in the ancient world. His voice carried the particular excitement of someone who had spent his life among documents and still found himself surprised by what they could reveal. Helena listened to the careful way he described his discovery, the methodical approach that had led him to recognize the significance of what others might have overlooked, and she felt the familiar pleasure of witnessing genuine intellectual passion at work. This was another form of the good life, the satisfaction of work that felt meaningful, that contributed to the larger project of human understanding, that connected individual effort to something greater than personal ambition. The conversation had grown quieter now, more reflective, as if the advancing evening naturally encouraged deeper consideration of the day's thoughts and experiences. Helena found herself thinking about her own work, the Epicurean texts that had occupied her attention for months, and how their emphasis on friendship and simple pleasure seemed to find perfect expression in moments like this. The philosopher had written about the importance of choosing one's companions carefully, of creating communities based on shared values rather than convenience or necessity. Looking around the table at these faces that had become so familiar, so dear to her over the years, Helena understood that she had been fortunate enough to find herself part of exactly such a community, a gathering of minds and hearts that had formed naturally around their common devotion to learning and understanding. The oil lamps flickered slightly in the evening breeze that moved through the open windows, their flames dancing in patterns that seemed to mirror the flow of conversation around the table. Helena watched the play of light and shadow across the faces of her companions, noting how the gentle illumination softened features and created an atmosphere of intimacy that made even familiar people seem newly interesting, worthy of closer attention. This too was part of what made these evening meals so precious. The way lamplight transformed ordinary moments into something that felt almost ceremonial, as if the simple act of sharing food and conversation had been elevated into a form of communion that connected them not just to each other, but to all the scholars and thinkers who had gathered in similar circumstances throughout history. As the evening deepened and the conversation began to wind toward its natural conclusion, Helena felt the particular satisfaction that came from having spent time well in the company of people who shared her deepest interests and commitments. Tomorrow would bring new texts to examine, new questions to consider, new opportunities to participate in the ongoing conversation between past and present that gave meaning to their scholarly work. But for now, in this moment of gentle communion, surrounded by the warm light of oil lamps and the comfortable presence of intellectual companions, she found herself perfectly content to exist in the present, to savor the simple pleasure of belonging to a community where ideas mattered more than status, where friendship was based on shared curiosity rather than mutual advantage, where the ancient questions continued to find new voices willing to engage with them seriously and with hope. The oil in Costas's lamp burned with that particular steadiness that came only in the deepest hours of night, when the air itself seemed to thicken and hold the flame more gently. He had carried this same lamp through these corridors for 7 years now, and its light had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. The bronze base warmed his palm in the way that spoke of countless nights, countless rounds through the vast halls of the great library. Tonight, as he began his customary circuit through the eastern wing, the flame cast the same golden circle on the marble floors, the same dancing shadows against the towering shelves, yet something in the very quality of the darkness seemed different. He moved with the particular quiet of one who had learned to belong to the night. His sandals, worn soft from years of these rounds, made only the gentlest whisper against the stone. The sound seemed to merge with the distant settling of the great building itself, the almost imperceptible creaks and sighs that came when the day's heat finally released its hold on wood and stone. In this atmosphere of settled quiet and gentle flame, Costas found himself moving more slowly than usual, his attention drawn to details that had become so familiar they had long since ceased to register. The philosophy wing stretched before him in its accustomed order. Row upon row of scrolls stood in their appointed places, their papyrus surfaces catching and releasing his lamplight as he passed. Here were the works of Plato, there the treatises of Aristotle, beyond them the more recent commentaries that scholars had been adding to the collection for generations. He knew the location of each major work, could find his way to any section in complete darkness if necessary. Yet tonight, as his lamp illuminated the familiar spines and labels, he found himself reading them as if for the first time, noting the careful script of the catalogers, the way certain scrolls showed the gentle wear of frequent consultation. It was in the third alcove of the philosophy section that he first encountered what would later seem like a sign, though at the time it appeared merely as an oddity in his routine. Demetrius sat at his usual desk, a scroll spread before him, but his hands lay motionless on either side of the papyrus. The scholar's eyes were fixed on the text, yet Costas could sense immediately that no reading was taking place. The lamp on Demetrius's desk burned low, its flame beginning to flutter in that way that warned of imminent extinction, yet the man seemed unaware of it entirely. Costas approached with the quiet courtesy that had always marked his interactions with the scholars. He had once been one of them himself, before his father's death had required him to seek more immediate employment to support his mother and sisters. The transition from scholar to night watchman had been made without bitterness, but it had taught him the value of discretion, the importance of moving through the world of learning without disturbing its delicate rhythms. "The lamp requires oil," he said softly, setting his own light on the desk beside Demetrius's. The scholar looked up as if emerging from deep water. His eyes took a moment to focus, to register Costas's presence. "Yes," he said, though his voice carried a distraction that suggested his thoughts remained elsewhere. Yes, of course. Costas refilled the lamp from the small vessel he carried, watching as the flame steadied and brightened. In the improved light, he could see that the scroll before Demetrius was one of Heraclitus's fragments, a text he had seen the scholar consult many times before. Yet tonight Demetrius stared at it, as if it contained some message he could not quite decipher. "All things flow," Demetrius murmured, his finger tracing a line of text. "Nothing remains." The words hung in the quiet air between them. Costas found himself nodding, though he could not have said why the ancient philosopher's observation seemed particularly relevant to this moment. There was something in Demetrius's tone, a weight that suggested the words carried meaning beyond their philosophical context. "Will you be working much longer?" Costas asked, following the gentle protocol that governed these late-night encounters. "I'm not certain," Demetrius replied. "I find myself reluctant to leave tonight." Costas understood this reluctance. The library at night possessed a quality that the daylight hours could never match. In the darkness, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, one could feel the presence of all the minds that had contributed to this vast collection. It was a sensation both humbling and exhilarating, and he had often observed scholars who seemed unable to tear themselves away from it. Yet as he continued his rounds, moving deeper into the building's heart, Costas began to notice other signs of the same strange reluctance. In the astronomy section, he discovered 3 scholars huddled around a single table, their voices low and urgent. Their conversation ceased abruptly when his lamplight fell across their circle, and they looked up with expressions that seemed to blend guilt with something approaching fear. "Good evening," Costas offered, following his usual custom. The eldest of the 3, a man named Apollodorus, whom Costas had known for years, managed a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Good evening, Costas. We were just discussing some calculations." The explanation seemed reasonable enough, yet something in the way the scrolls were arranged on their table, something in the quality of their silence, suggested that their discussion had ranged far beyond mathematical considerations. Costas nodded and moved on, but he carried with him the image of their faces in the lamplight, the way they had looked at him as if he were an intruder rather than the familiar guardian of their nocturnal studies. The great reading hall stretched before him in its magnificent emptiness. During the day, this space hummed with the quiet activity of dozens of scholars, the rustle of papyrus, the scratch of stylus on wax tablet, the occasional murmur of consultation between colleagues. Now, in the deep of night, it held a cathedral silence that seemed to amplify the smallest sound. His footsteps, despite their careful quietness, seemed to echo from the distant ceiling, and the flame of his lamp created moving patterns on the painted walls that depicted the 9 muses in their eternal dance. Here, in this vast space dedicated to human knowledge, Costas felt most acutely the strangeness of this particular night. The air itself seemed to hold a quality of expectation, as if the building were waiting for something. He had experienced similar sensations before storms, when the atmosphere grew heavy and still, when animals grew restless, and the very light seemed to change its character. But tonight there were no clouds visible through the high windows, no wind to rattle the shutters. He paused at the center of the hall, his lamp creating a small island of light in the vast darkness. Around him, the shelves rose like cliffs, their contents representing the accumulated learning of generations. Mathematics and medicine, history and poetry, philosophy and natural science, all of human knowledge seemed to press in around him, waiting in the darkness with an almost palpable presence. It was then that he noticed the quality of the silence had changed. Somewhere in the building, barely audible, came the sound of movement. Not the usual settling of wood and stone, but something more purposeful. Footsteps, perhaps, or the whisper of robes against marble. The sound was too distant to locate precisely, too faint to identify with certainty, yet it added another layer to his growing sense that this night was unlike all the others that had preceded it. As he completed his circuit and began the return journey to his small chamber near the main entrance, Costas found himself moving even more slowly than before. Each familiar corridor seemed to demand closer attention. Each alcove and reading nook appeared to hold significance beyond its ordinary function. The flame of his lamp, which had burned so steadily throughout the night, now seemed to flicker more frequently, as if responding to currents in the air that he could not detect. In the morning, he would struggle to articulate what had been different about this night. The irregularities he had observed, Demetrius's strange distraction, the whispered conference of the astronomers, the subtle wrongness in the building's atmosphere, would seem insufficient to explain the profound unease that had settled over him. Yet as he finally reached his chamber and set his lamp on its accustomed shelf, Costas knew with the certainty that comes from deep instinct that something fundamental was about to change. The great library, which had stood as a monument to human learning for centuries, felt like a creature holding its breath before an inevitable transformation that would alter everything forever. Marcus moved through the geography section with the measured steps of a man who had learned patience from decades among ancient texts. The bronze lamp in his hand cast a steady circle of golden light, illuminating the rolled maps that lined the walls like sleeping sentinels. Each papyrus held within its careful curves the knowledge of coastlines and mountain ranges, trade routes and forgotten cities, all waiting for the gentle touch of scholarly hands. He set the lamp upon the great map table, its surface worn smooth by countless scholars who had bent over these same charts, tracing the boundaries of the known world with reverent fingers. The wood gleamed in the lamplight, marked by the careful measurements and notations of generations past. Tonight, something drew him to a particular collection of maps, ones he had examined hundreds of times before, but which seemed to call to him with unusual insistence. The first scroll unrolled beneath his hands with the whispered sound of ancient papyrus, revealing a chart of Mediterranean trade routes that had been old when his grandfather was young. The ink had faded to the color of dried blood, but the lines remained clear, marking the paths that connected Rome to Alexandria, Athens to Carthage, the great web of commerce and culture that bound the civilized world together. As his fingers traced the familiar coastlines, Marcus felt something shift in his understanding, like a door opening in a room he thought he knew completely. These were not merely Roman conquests marked upon the papyrus, but something far more complex and beautiful. Here were the routes his own ancestors might have traveled, not as conquerors, but as merchants, scholars, pilgrims seeking wisdom in foreign lands. The lamplight flickered slightly in a draught that seemed to carry with it the whispers of ancient travelers, men who had followed these very routes with their precious cargoes of silk and spices, their scrolls of poetry and philosophy. Marcus could almost hear their voices in the gentle stirring of air through the map cases, the soft rustle of papyrus settling into its eternal rest. The atmosphere of the geography section held these echoes like a vessel holds water, preserving them in the amber of scholarly silence. He pulled another map from its resting place, this one showing the Nile Delta in exquisite detail. The cartographer had marked not only the river's many mouths, but also the locations of temples and libraries, the places where knowledge was gathered and preserved. Alexandria appeared as a jewel at the delta's edge, connected by thin lines to Memphis, Thebes, and the great temples of the south. The lamplight danced across the ancient inks, and Marcus saw his own story written in these careful lines. He had come to Alexandria as a young Roman administrator, sent to oversee the library's operations with the cool efficiency expected of his kind. But somewhere in the years that followed, something had changed. The daily handling of Greek texts, the conversations with Alexandrian scholars, the gradual understanding of how knowledge flowed like water between cultures, all of this had worked upon him with the patient persistence of rain upon stone. The quiet atmosphere of the section seemed to deepen around him, as if the very air was thick with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Each map case held not just geographical knowledge, but the dreams of explorers, the careful observations of merchants, the desperate calculations of generals planning distant campaigns. In the gentle shadows cast by his lamp, Marcus could sense the presence of all those who had bent over these same charts, their fingers tracing the same routes he now followed with his own weathered hands. He unrolled a third map, this one showing the eastern trade routes that connected Alexandria to India and the lands beyond. Here were marked the paths that brought spices and silk, but also ideas and philosophies, the endless exchange that made Alexandria more than just another Roman city. It was a place where cultures met and mingled, where a man might arrive as one thing and discover himself becoming something entirely new. The silence of the geography section wrapped around him like a familiar cloak, broken only by the soft whisper of his breathing and the occasional settling of ancient papyrus in its cases. He had always been most comfortable here, among the maps and charts that reduced the vast complexity of the world to manageable lines and measurements. But tonight, as he studied these ancient routes, he understood that his own journey had been equally transformative, if less visible to the naked eye. The bronze lamp cast its steady glow across a fourth map, one that showed the northern territories beyond the Alps, lands that most Romans considered barbarous and unworthy of serious study. But the cartographer had marked here too the locations of Celtic settlements, the paths of seasonal migration, the sacred groves where druids gathered to preserve their own forms of ancient wisdom. Marcus found himself wondering what knowledge might be lost if these cultures disappeared, what understanding of the natural world might vanish with the last of the old priests. He was no longer the young Roman who had arrived in Alexandria 30 years ago, full of administrative efficiency and cultural certainty. Nor was he simply a Greek scholar, despite his fluency in the language and his deep appreciation for Alexandrian learning. He had become something new, something that perhaps had no name but existed nonetheless, a man shaped by the meeting of cultures, by the daily handling of wisdom from many lands. The atmosphere in the geography section seemed to pulse gently with the rhythm of his own breathing, as if the room itself was alive with quiet contemplation. The shadows cast by the lamp moved slowly across the map cases, creating patterns that reminded him of the way sunlight moved across water, constantly changing, yet fundamentally constant. In this peaceful backdrop of ancient knowledge and eternal shadows, Marcus felt his understanding deepening like roots finding water in dry soil. The realization came to him with the gentle inevitability of dawn, neither sudden nor shocking, but simply true. He had spent so many years thinking of himself as a Roman guarding Greek knowledge, when in reality he had become something far more interesting. A living bridge between worlds, a man whose very existence proved that wisdom recognized no boundaries of birth or blood. He unrolled one final map, this one showing the African coast beyond Egypt, the mysterious lands that Greek geographers had marked with careful uncertainty. Here were the sources of gold and ivory, but also the origins of mathematical knowledge that had flowed northward to Alexandria, becoming part of the great synthesis that made the library possible. The cartographer had noted the locations of ancient kingdoms, the paths of caravan routes that carried not just goods, but ideas across the vast expanses of desert and savanna. As he rolled up the maps with practiced care, Marcus felt a deep peace settle over him, like dust settling after a long journey. Tomorrow might bring uncertainty, but tonight he understood something essential about his own story. The library had not simply employed him, it had transformed him, just as it had transformed countless others who had walked these halls with open minds and willing hearts. The lamp flame danced in a draught from somewhere deep in the building, casting moving shadows across the map cases that seemed to breathe with the accumulated wisdom of ages. In those shadows, Marcus could almost see the ghosts of all the scholars who had worked here before him, men and women from every corner of the known world who had found in Alexandria not just a repository of knowledge, but a place of becoming. He gathered his materials with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks, but now that care felt different, imbued with a deeper understanding of its purpose. He was not simply maintaining the library's collections. He was tending the garden where human wisdom grew and flourished, where the boundaries between cultures dissolved in the face of shared curiosity and wonder. The geography section settled back into its patient silence as Marcus prepared to continue his rounds, the gentle atmosphere of ancient knowledge and eternal contemplation wrapping around him like a benediction. But he carried with him now a new understanding of the maps he guarded, not just as records of the physical world, but as charts of human possibility, marking the routes by which a man might travel from who he was to who he might become. Thalia bent over her copying desk in the astronomy alcove, the bronze lamp casting its steady glow across the papyrus before her. The night had grown deep around her, but she felt no weariness, only the familiar pleasure of matching her careful script to the ancient words that flowed beneath her reed pen. She was working on a text by Aristarchus, his revolutionary ideas about the sun's position in the heavens requiring her most precise attention to detail. As she reached for a fresh sheet of papyrus, her hand brushed against a scroll she had completed months earlier, and curiosity made her unroll it slightly. What she saw there made her pause, reed pen suspended in midair, as she encountered something unexpected, her own handwriting, but somehow foreign to her eyes. The marginalia were unmistakably hers, the same careful formation of letters she had learned from her first master, but the thoughts they recorded seemed to belong to a stranger. Here, beside a passage about lunar eclipses, her younger self had written a tentative question about the relationship between celestial movements and earthly tides. The observation was correct as far as it went, but so simple, so hesitant in its formulation. The gentle atmosphere of the astronomy alcove seemed to deepen around her as she contemplated this discovery, the soft whisper of papyrus and the steady glow of lamplight creating a cocoon of scholarly solitude. The alcove had always been her sanctuary, its walls lined with the accumulated wisdom of centuries, each scroll a conversation waiting to be resumed. In the peaceful backdrop of ancient knowledge and flickering shadows, she could trace the arc of her own transformation with the same precision she brought to copying celestial calculations. She set down her current work and unrolled the older scroll completely, following her past self's notes with growing fascination. Each margin comment revealed a mind grappling with concepts that now seemed as familiar to her as breathing. Where her younger self had struggled to understand Hipparchus's method for calculating stellar positions, she now saw elegant mathematical relationships that connected not just to astronomy, but to geometry, music, and the very structure of rational thought itself. The transformation was so gradual that she had not noticed it happening, like the way dawn creeps across the sky without announcing its arrival. But here, written in her own hand, was the evidence of change, not just in knowledge acquired, but in the very way her mind approached the mysteries of the cosmos. The quiet atmosphere of the alcove held this revelation like a vessel holds precious oil, allowing her to examine it without disturbing its essential nature. She found a passage where she had copied Ptolemy's description of the celestial spheres, and in the margin, her younger self had written a careful summary of the basic principles. But now, reading those same words, she saw layers of meaning that had been invisible to her before. She understood how Ptolemy's system connected to earlier astronomical traditions, how it both built upon and departed from the work of Apollonius and Hipparchus, how the mathematical models reflected not just observational accuracy, but philosophical assumptions about the nature of perfection and divine order. The lamp flame wavered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the ancient texts that surrounded her alcove. Scrolls containing the wisdom of centuries lined the walls. The works of Aristarchus and Eratosthenes, Apollodorus and Conon, each one a conversation partner in her ongoing education. She realized now that her copying had been far more than mechanical reproduction. It had been a form of dialogue, each carefully formed letter a question posed to ancient minds, each completed page an answer slowly taking shape in her understanding. The gentle rustle of papyrus as she moved between scrolls created a rhythm that seemed to match her breathing, as if the very act of scholarly contemplation had its own natural cadence. In this atmosphere of concentrated learning, surrounded by the patient wisdom of ages, Thalia felt herself connected to an unbroken chain of seekers who had sat in similar alcoves, bent over similar texts, pursuing the same eternal questions about the nature of the cosmos. She picked up her reed pen again, but instead of returning to Aristarchus, she found herself adding a new note in the margin of her old work. Her handwriting had changed too, she noticed, more confident now, the letters flowing with the assurance that came from years of practice. But more than that, her thoughts moved differently across the papyrus, making connections that would have been impossible for the young woman who had first copied these texts. The astronomy section around her seemed to pulse with quiet life, as if the accumulated wisdom of centuries was breathing gently in the darkness. She had always known that the library was a place of learning, but only now did she understand how that learning happened, not through sudden revelation, but through the slow accretion of understanding, like sediment settling in a riverbed to form new land. Her fingers traced the words she had written months ago about the precession of the equinoxes, and she smiled at the careful way her younger self had explained the phenomenon. The explanation was correct, but incomplete, missing the deeper implications that now seemed obvious to her. She understood now how precession connected to the great cycles of time that governed not just the heavens, but human history itself, how the slow wobble of the Earth's axis created the vast ages that philosophers spoke of in hushed tones. The silence of the alcove wrapped around her like a cocoon, broken only by the soft scratch of her pen and the occasional whisper of papyrus being unrolled. The gentle atmosphere of scholarly concentration seemed to hold time itself in suspension, allowing her to move freely between past and present, between the young woman who had written these tentative notes and the mature scholar she had become. She had spent so many nights here copying and studying that the space had become an extension of her own mind. Every scroll had its place, every reference its purpose, and she moved among them with the unconscious grace of long familiarity. The lamp cast its steady light across surfaces worn smooth by countless hours of careful work, creating an environment of such profound peace that even the most complex astronomical calculations seemed to resolve themselves with natural ease. But tonight felt different, charged with the recognition of her own growth. She was no longer the eager but uncertain young woman who had first taken up residence in this alcove. The library had shaped her, yes, but she had also shaped herself through countless hours of careful attention to the wisdom of the past. Each text she had copied had left its mark upon her understanding, and those marks had accumulated into something new, a mind capable of seeing patterns and connections that would have been invisible to her younger self. The gentle stirring of air through the alcove carried with it the faint scent of aged papyrus and lamp oil, the distinctive fragrance of scholarly dedication that had permeated these walls for generations. In this atmosphere of concentrated learning, Thalia felt herself part of something larger than her individual quest for knowledge, a community of seekers that transcended the boundaries of time and culture. She unrolled another of her early works, this one dealing with the complex calculations required to predict planetary positions. Her younger self's notes revealed a mind wrestling with concepts that seemed almost insurmountable, each step in the mathematical progression requiring careful verification and re-verification. But now she could see the elegant simplicity underlying those calculations, the way each apparent complexity resolved into a more fundamental pattern. As she prepared to return to her current work, Thalia felt a deep gratitude for the path that had brought her to this moment. The library had given her more than knowledge. It had given her the tools to think, to question, to understand. And in return, she had given it her careful attention, her patient dedication, her willingness to be changed by the ancient wisdom that flowed through her hands like water through a channel. The lamp burned steadily beside her, its light falling across pages covered with the thoughts of centuries. In that light, past and present seemed to merge, and she understood that she was part of an unbroken chain of scholars stretching back to the library's founding and forward into an unknowable future. The young woman who had written those hesitant marginalia was gone, transformed into someone capable of adding her own voice to the great conversation that echoed through these halls. The peaceful atmosphere of the alcove seemed to embrace this understanding, holding it gently like a mother holds a sleeping child. In the soft interplay of lamplight and shadow, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, Thalia felt the profound satisfaction that comes from recognizing one's place in the larger pattern of human learning. Tomorrow would bring new texts to copy, new insights to pursue, but tonight she rested in the knowledge of how far she had traveled from who she once was to who she had become. Helena found herself drawn from the philosophy section into the library's small interior courtyard, where a garden had been carefully tended for generations of scholars seeking respite from their studies. The pre-dawn air was cool and still, carrying the mingled fragrances of night-blooming flowers and aromatic herbs that grew in careful profusion among the narrow pathways. She had been studying Epicurean texts for most of the night, her mind working through the subtle arguments about pleasure and virtue, the relationship between desire and happiness. But something about the enclosed garden called to her, as if the living plants might offer insights that even the most eloquent philosophical treatises could not provide. The garden was small, no more than 30 paces across, but it had been designed with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the library. Raised beds contained medicinal plants that scholars used to treat the ailments that came from long hours bent over manuscripts: eyebright for tired eyes, mint for digestive troubles, lavender for the tensions that accumulated in neck and shoulders. But there were also purely ornamental plants, chosen for their beauty and fragrance, their ability to create a sense of peace in the midst of intensive study. The gentle murmur of the fountain at the garden's center provided a constant backdrop to her contemplation, its water catching the last starlight in tiny diamonds of reflection. The sound was just loud enough to mask the distant noises of the city without overwhelming the garden's essential quietude, creating an atmosphere of such profound tranquility that even the most complex philosophical problems seemed to resolve themselves with natural ease. As Helena walked slowly along the paths, her philosopher's mind began to make unexpected connections. The way the mint had spread quietly through its designated space, never overreaching its boundaries but filling every available corner with green abundance, reminded her of Epicurus's teachings about pleasure finding its natural limits. The plant neither strained beyond its proper domain nor failed to claim what was rightfully its own. It simply grew with the easy confidence of something following its nature. A night-blooming jasmine released its intoxicating fragrance into the cool air, and Helena paused beside it, breathing in the sweetness that seemed to exist for no purpose other than beauty itself. Here was another Epicurean principle made manifest, the idea that some pleasures were complete in themselves, requiring no justification beyond their own perfection. The flower's fragrance asked nothing of her, offered nothing beyond its own lovely presence, yet in that offering was a kind of wisdom that all her years of study had only begun to approach. The peaceful atmosphere of the garden seemed to deepen around her as she contemplated this living philosophy, the gentle interplay of water and wind, fragrance and shadow, creating a natural sanctuary where abstract concepts became tangible realities. In this environment of such profound serenity, Helena felt her understanding shifting from intellectual comprehension to something more visceral and immediate. She settled on one of the stone benches that were positioned at intervals throughout the garden, each one worn smooth by generations of contemplative scholars. From here she could see how the garden's designer had created a sense of natural abundance while maintaining careful order. Each plant had its place, its purpose, its relationship to the whole, yet nothing felt forced or artificial. It was cultivation that honored rather than violated the essential nature of what grew here. The small fountain continued its gentle song, the water flowing over stones that had been polished smooth by countless years of patient erosion. Helena found herself thinking of how Epicurus had written about the pleasure of simple things: clean water, fresh air, the company of friends engaged in philosophical conversation. Here in this small sanctuary, she could feel the truth of those teachings in her bones, could understand how the philosopher's garden in Athens must have provided similar moments of clarity and peace. A rosemary bush near her bench released its sharp, clean scent when the night breeze stirred its needle-like leaves. The herb had been sacred to memory since ancient times, and Helena smiled at the appropriateness of its presence in a place dedicated to preserving human wisdom. But more than that, she recognized in the plant's sturdy persistence another lesson about the nature of enduring pleasure. Rosemary asked little: poor soil, occasional rain, the touch of sunlight, yet it gave abundantly, its fragrance and flavor enriching everything around it. The gentle stirring of leaves in the night breeze created a soft susurrus that seemed to carry the whispered conversations of all the scholars who had found refuge in this garden over the centuries. In this atmosphere of accumulated contemplation, Helena felt herself connected to an unbroken chain of seekers who had sat on these same benches, breathed the same fragrances, listened to the same eternal music of water over stone. As the night deepened toward dawn, Helena felt her understanding of Epicurean philosophy shifting from intellectual comprehension to something more visceral and immediate. The garden was teaching her things that no text could convey: how pleasure and simplicity were not opposites but allies, how true abundance came not from grasping, but from appreciating what was already present, how wisdom could be found not just in books, but in the patient observation of how life actually worked. She thought of the debates she had witnessed in the philosophy section, scholars arguing about the precise meaning of ataraxia, the serene tranquility that Epicurus claimed was the highest form of pleasure. But here, surrounded by plants that grew according to their nature without anxiety or striving, she felt that tranquility settling over her like dew. It was not the absence of feeling, as some critics claimed, but the presence of a deeper kind of satisfaction, the pleasure of being exactly where and what one was meant to be. The garden walls were low enough that she could see the library's towers rising beyond them, connecting this green sanctuary to the greater temple of learning that surrounded it. But rather than feeling the contrast between natural and human wisdom, Helena sensed their fundamental unity. Both the garden and the library were expressions of the same impulse, the desire to cultivate and preserve what was most valuable in human experience. The peaceful atmosphere of the courtyard seemed to pulse gently with the rhythm of growing things, the slow circulation of sap and the patient unfurling of leaves, creating a natural meditation that required no conscious effort to follow. In this environment of such profound harmony, Helena felt her philosophical understanding deepening like roots finding water in fertile soil. A night-flying moth brushed past her face, drawn by some invisible current of air or scent, and she watched it disappear into the shadows between the herb beds. Even this small creature was following its nature, seeking what it needed without apology or explanation. There was something profoundly Epicurean in that simple pursuit of satisfaction, something that connected the moth's flight to the highest aspirations of human philosophy. The fountain's gentle music continued unchanged, its water flowing in patterns that had been established when the garden was first planted, yet each moment bringing something new: a different play of starlight on the surface, a subtle shift in the sound as the water level rose or fell with the seasons. Helena recognized in this constancy and change another principle of Epicurean thought: the idea that true pleasure was found not in novelty, but in the deepening appreciation of enduring realities. She rose from the bench and walked slowly around the fountain, her footsteps silent on the smooth stones that formed the pathway. The herbs released their fragrances as she passed, thyme and oregano, sage and chamomile, each one a small gift that asked nothing in return. The garden was teaching her about the economics of genuine pleasure, how the most satisfying experiences were often those that cost nothing yet enriched everything they touched. The gentle atmosphere of the courtyard seemed to embrace her understanding, holding it like cupped hands hold water, allowing her to examine it without disturbing its essential nature. In this sanctuary of growing things and flowing water, Helena felt herself becoming part of the larger conversation between human wisdom and natural truth that had been taking place in this spot for generations. As she prepared to return to her studies, Helena carried with her a new understanding of the texts she had been reading. The garden had shown her that Epicurean philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of living that could be as natural and necessary as the growth of plants toward light. The principles she had memorized and debated were not abstract propositions, but descriptions of how life actually wanted to unfold when freed from the artificial constraints of anxiety and desire. The pre-dawn air stirred the leaves around her with a sound like whispered conversations, and Helena felt herself part of a larger dialogue that included not just the human voices that echoed through the library's halls, but the quiet wisdom of growing things, the patient teachings of earth and water and air. In learning to read this natural text, she had found a new way to understand the written wisdom that awaited her return to the philosophy section. The fountain continued its eternal song as she made her way back toward the library's interior, its gentle music following her through the doorway like a benediction. In the peaceful atmosphere of water and stone, fragrance and shadow, Helena had discovered that the deepest philosophical truths were not hidden in complex arguments, but revealed in the simple observation of how life actually worked when allowed to follow its essential nature. Costas climbed the narrow stone steps to the library's highest tower, his footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The night watch had become a meditation for him over the years, these quiet hours when the great building settled into sleep and he alone moved through its darkened corridors. But tonight, something drew him to the tower's peak, to the small chamber where he could look out over the sleeping city of Alexandria. The room was spare and functional, furnished only with a simple wooden chair and a table where previous watchmen had kept their logs. The windows faced in all directions, offering panoramic views of the city that spread below like a living map. To the north, the harbor lay dark and still, the great lighthouse dormant until dawn would call it back to life. To the south, the city's geometric streets stretched toward the desert, punctuated by the dark rectangles of courtyards and the silver threads of canals that brought life-giving water from the Nile. Costas lit the oil lamp that sat on the table, its flame steady and unwavering in the still air. The light was small but sufficient, creating a pool of warmth in the stone chamber while leaving the windows clear for his vigil. He had performed this ritual countless times, but tonight it felt different, charged with a significance he could not quite name. He settled into the chair and allowed his gaze to wander over the familiar landscape. Alexandria slept below him, its inhabitants dreaming their private dreams while he kept watch over the treasure house of human knowledge that rose around him. The responsibility had once felt overwhelming, the weight of protecting so much accumulated wisdom, almost too much for one man to bear. But time had taught him that the burden was also a privilege, a trust that had shaped him in ways he was only now beginning to understand. 30 years ago, he had come to Alexandria as a young scholar, bright with ambition and burning with the desire to make his mark among the great minds of his generation. He had planned to study rhetoric and philosophy, to join the ranks of those whose names would be remembered alongside Aristotle and Plato. But life had taken a different path, as life so often does, and what had seemed like failure at the time now revealed itself as transformation. The position of night watchman had been offered as a temporary solution when his studies faltered, a way to remain close to the library while earning enough to survive. He had accepted reluctantly, seeing it as a step backward from his scholarly ambitions. But as the months turned to years, something unexpected had happened. The nightly rounds through the library's halls had given him an intimacy with the collection that few scholars ever achieved. He knew every section, every alcove, every scholar's particular habits and preferences. He had watched generations of students arrive full of eager questions and depart with the measured confidence of learning. He had seen the library through seasons of abundance and seasons of struggle, through political upheavals and peaceful interludes, through the slow accumulation of new knowledge and the careful preservation of old wisdom. The night air carried the distant sound of waves against the harbor walls, a rhythm so constant it had become part of the city's breathing. From this height, Alexandria revealed its true nature, not just a collection of buildings and streets, but an organism sustained by the flow of knowledge and commerce, by the dreams and ambitions of all who had made it their home. The gentle Mediterranean breeze stirred the lamp flame slightly, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls that seemed to dance with the accumulated memories of all the watchmen who had sat in this chair before him. Costas found himself thinking of his predecessor, old Demetrius, who had trained him in the rituals of the watch. Demetrius had been a philosopher once, a student of the Stoics who had found in the library's quiet halls a different kind of wisdom than what the schools offered. He had taught Costas that vigilance was not merely about preventing theft or fire, but about maintaining the continuity that allowed knowledge to flow from one generation to the next. "The library dreams," Demetrius had said during one of their last conversations, "and we are its guardians in sleep, ensuring that when it wakes, all its memories remain intact." At the time, Costas had thought the old man was speaking metaphorically, but years of solitary watches had revealed the deeper truth in those words. The building did seem to dream, its vast collection of texts creating a kind of collective unconscious that whispered through the halls in the deepest hours of night. From his tower window, Costas could see the first pale line of dawn beginning to separate sea from sky at the horizon. The sight filled him with a familiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Another night successfully completed, another day beginning with the library's treasures intact. But tonight, the approaching dawn seemed to carry additional weight, as if it marked not just the end of another watch, but the conclusion of something larger. He thought of the scholars sleeping in their quarters below, each one carrying forward some fragment of the vast conversation that echoed through these halls. Marcus, with his careful maps and his quiet transformation from Roman administrator to something more complex and beautiful. Thalia, with her growing mastery of astronomical texts, her mind expanding to encompass the movements of the spheres. Helena, with her deepening understanding of philosophical principles, her recognition that wisdom could be found in gardens as well as books. Each of them had been changed by their time in the library, just as he had been changed. But his transformation had taken a different path, leading not to scholarly recognition, but to something perhaps more valuable, a profound sense of purpose, a knowledge that his life had been spent in service to something greater than himself. The harbor below began to show the first signs of stirring, fishing boats preparing for the day's work, their lanterns creating tiny constellations reflected in the dark water. The sight reminded him of the countless dawns he had witnessed from this same window, each one marking another successful night of guardianship. There was something deeply satisfying in this repetition, this daily renewal of his commitment to the library's preservation. In the growing light, he could make out the familiar landmarks that had become the geography of his contemplation. The museum, with its covered walkways where scholars debated the mysteries of natural philosophy, the residential quarters where visiting intellectuals from across the Mediterranean world found temporary homes, the administrative buildings where the complex work of cataloging and preserving the world's knowledge continued day after day, year after year. Costas had come to understand that the library was more than the sum of its parts, more than even the extraordinary collection of texts it contained. It was a living embodiment of humanity's desire to understand, to preserve, to build upon the discoveries of previous generations. His role as night watchman had made him witness to this continuity in ways that daylight scholars, focused on their particular researches, rarely experienced. The city below began to stir as the first merchants made their way toward the harbor, their torches creating moving points of light in the pre-dawn darkness. Soon the library would wake as well, filling with the familiar sounds of scholarly activity, the whisper of papyrus being unrolled, the scratch of reed pens, the low murmur of discussion and debate. But for now, in these last moments of his watch, Costas felt the deep peace that came from knowing his duty was complete. He had become something the library needed but rarely acknowledged, not just a guardian of its physical safety, but a keeper of its spirit, a living memory of all the scholars who had passed through these halls. His rounds through the darkened building had made him intimate with every corner, every collection, every story of discovery and loss that these walls contained. The gentle sound of water in the courtyard fountains below drifted up to his tower room, a constant murmur that had become as natural to him as his own heartbeat. These fountains had run continuously for generations, their peaceful flow a reminder that some things endured beyond the brief span of individual lives. Like the library itself, like the knowledge it preserved, like his own quiet dedication, the fountains continued their gentle song simply because it was their nature to do so. In choosing duty over ambition, he had found a different kind of wisdom. He understood now that there were many ways to serve knowledge, many paths to meaning. The scholar who made great discoveries was no more valuable than the watchman who ensured those discoveries would survive for future generations to build upon. Both were necessary, both were part of the great human project of understanding and preservation. The lamp flame danced slightly in a draught from the window, and Costas smiled at its persistence. Like the library itself, like the knowledge it contained, like his own quiet dedication, the flame continued to burn simply because it was its nature to do so. There was something profoundly satisfying in that continuity, that refusal to be extinguished by the darkness that surrounded it. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of true dawn, Costas prepared to end his watch. The familiar ritual of extinguishing the lamp, recording the night's observations in the watchman's log, and beginning his final round through the building's halls awaited him. But he carried with him the understanding that had come to him in this tower room, that his life had not been a failure or a compromise, but a different kind of success, measured not in recognition or achievement, but in faithfulness to a trust that had shaped him into exactly who he was meant to be. The Mediterranean dawn spread slowly across the city, painting the harbor waters with soft gold and rose. Alexandria awakened gradually, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. And in the library's highest tower, a watchman completed another night's vigil, his quiet dedication ensuring that when the scholars returned to their studies, they would find the great conversation of human knowledge exactly as they had left it, ready to continue for another day. The oil lamp flickered against the pre-dawn darkness, casting wavering shadows across the walls of Demetrius's private study. For 37 years, this small chamber had been his sanctuary within the great Library of Alexandria, a place where he could retreat from the endless demands of cataloging and preservation to commune with the books that had shaped his understanding of the world. Now, in what might be his final hours within these walls, he found himself surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime's devotion to learning. His arthritic hands moved slowly across the familiar spines that lined his personal shelves. Each volume represented not merely accumulated knowledge, but a relationship forged through countless hours of careful study and meticulous preservation. Here was Aristotle's treatise on natural philosophy, rescued from a merchant's cart where it had been destined for wrapping fish. There, a collection of Sappho's verses, copied in his own careful hand from fragments that had arrived water-damaged from Rhodes. The room itself bore witness to his life's work. Every surface held carefully arranged scrolls and codices, their placement following a system that existed nowhere but in his memory. The walls, built into the living stone of the library's foundation, housed shelves that groaned under the weight of precious manuscripts. A reading stand, worn smooth by decades of use, held his current project, a comparative analysis of astronomical observations from Babylon and Egypt that he now knew he would never complete. Demetrius lifted a small codex from the shelf nearest his chair, feeling the familiar weight of its wooden covers in his palms. This was Euclid's Elements, not the famous copy housed in the library's main collection, but his own working version, annotated with decades of marginalia and cross-references. His younger self had believed that such annotations diminished a text's purity, but age had taught him that knowledge lived not in pristine preservation, but in the dialogue between reader and author across the centuries. The brazier at his feet glowed with banked coals, providing gentle warmth against the morning chill. Through the small window that faced east toward the harbor, he could hear the first tentative songs of birds greeting the approaching dawn. The sound carried him back to another morning, decades past, when he had first entered this study as a junior librarian, overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for humanity's greatest collection of learning. Then he had seen his role simply to preserve, to catalog, to maintain. The books were artifacts to be protected, knowledge to be guarded against the ravages of time and ignorance. He had approached each manuscript with the reverence of a priest tending sacred relics, believing that his worth lay in his ability to keep them safe from harm. but as his fingers traced the worn edges of familiar texts, Demetrius understood that his true legacy walked the library's halls in human form. Thalia, who had arrived as a frightened girl clutching her father's letter of introduction, now moved through the collection with growing confidence, her questions revealing an intellect that hungered for understanding rather than mere facts. Her transformation from timid scholar to passionate researcher represented something far more valuable than any preserved manuscript. Marcus, with his quiet dedication and methodical approach to organization, had absorbed not just the techniques of preservation, but the deeper philosophy that guided the work. Demetrius had watched him develop from a careful follower of instructions into someone who could anticipate the needs of scholars before they voiced them, who understood that true service to learning meant making knowledge accessible rather than simply keeping it safe. Helena's deepening wisdom showed itself not in grand pronouncements, but in the gentle way she guided younger scholars toward discoveries they believed they had made independently. Her ability to ask the right question at the right moment, to suggest a connection that opened new avenues of inquiry, demonstrated the highest form of teaching, one that empowered others to learn rather than simply dispensing information. And Costas, whose protective love for the library manifested in countless small acts of care and maintenance, embodied the understanding that preservation was not about keeping things unchanged, but about ensuring they remained available for each new generation of seekers. His calloused hands had repaired more manuscripts than Demetrius could count, each mended page a testament to the belief that knowledge belonged to the future as much as to the past. Demetrius set down the Euclid and reached for another volume, this one a collection of medical texts compiled by physicians from the museum's healing center. He remembered the day it had arrived, water-stained and partially illegible after a difficult journey from Pergamon. Working together, he and a young scribe named Andreas had spent months reconstructing damaged passages, comparing variant readings, consulting other sources to fill gaps where the text had become unreadable. Andreas had long since returned to his home city, but Demetrius knew he had carried with him not just the medical knowledge contained in those texts, but the methodology of careful scholarship, the patience required for accurate reconstruction, the humility to acknowledge uncertainty when evidence was incomplete. How many other students had passed through these halls, taking with them not merely facts, but ways of thinking, approaches to learning that would shape their understanding for the rest of their lives. The true inheritance of a librarian, Demetrius realized, was not measured in volumes preserved or catalogues completed. It lived in the minds he had helped to form, the curiosity he had nurtured, the love of learning he had fostered in others. The books themselves might survive the coming flames, or they might not. Such things lay beyond any individual's power to control completely. But the passion for inquiry, the respect for evidence, the joy of discovery that he had helped kindle in countless scholars would continue long after he was gone. He thought of the young scribes who had learned their craft under his guidance, now working in libraries and schools across the Mediterranean world. Each carried within them the standards of accuracy and care he had insisted upon, the understanding that their work served not their own glory, but the greater cause of human knowledge. They would teach others in turn, passing on not just technical skills, but the deeper values that made scholarship meaningful. The philosophers who had debated in the museum's halls, challenged by questions that forced them to examine their assumptions more carefully, had taken those habits of rigorous thinking to their own students. The physicians who had consulted the medical texts had applied their enhanced understanding to heal the sick in cities far from Alexandria. The astronomers who had studied the celestial observations preserved in the library had used that knowledge to navigate ships safely across dangerous waters. Demetrius's hands, though weakened by age, still moved with practiced precision as he arranged the texts on his reading stand. These physical objects, precious as they were, represented only the visible portion of his life's work. The invisible portion, the minds shaped, the questions asked, the understanding deepened, would prove far more durable than any manuscript. As the first light of dawn began to filter through his window, he felt a profound peace settle over him. The young people who had learned from him would face whatever came with the tools he had helped provide them. They would preserve what could be preserved, adapt what needed adaptation, and create new knowledge to replace what might be lost. This was the true meaning of continuity, he understood now. Not the static preservation of unchanging artifacts, but the dynamic transmission of living wisdom from one generation to the next. His legacy would walk on human feet, think with human minds, love learning with human hearts long after the last scroll had crumbled to dust. The lamp oil was burning low, but Demetrius felt no need to replenish it. The approaching dawn would provide light enough for whatever remained to be done. His life's work was complete, not because every task had been finished, but because the most important task, the nurturing of other minds, had been accomplished beyond his ability to measure. In the growing light, surrounded by the books that had been his companions for nearly 4 decades, Demetrius closed his eyes and listened to the awakening city beyond the library walls. Somewhere out there in schools and libraries, in workshops and healing centers, the true fruits of his labor continued to grow and flourish, carrying forward the light of learning into an uncertain but hopeful future. The oil lamp beside Demetrius flickered with the steady rhythm that had marked countless evenings in this chamber, its flame dancing in the still air with a hypnotic persistence that seemed to measure not minutes, but decades. He sat in his worn wooden chair, his arthritic hands folded peacefully in his lap, no longer fighting against their limitations, no longer reaching for scrolls or tablets or any of the implements of his trade. The chamber around him felt smaller now, more intimate, as if the walls lined with his personal collection of texts had drawn closer to embrace him in these final hours. Through the narrow window that faced the harbor, the Mediterranean night stretched endlessly, stars reflecting on water that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of ships laden with knowledge from every corner of the known world. The same stars that had shone on Aristotle when he walked these halls, on Euclid when he worked out his geometric proofs, on countless scholars whose names had been forgotten, but whose curiosity had added to the great conversation that lived within these walls. Demetrius thought of Thalia's careful script, each letter formed with the devotion of someone who understood that copying was itself a form of prayer. He thought of Marcus's methodical rounds through the geographical collections, his systematic approach masking a deep love for the mystery of distant places. He thought of Helena walking in the garden courtyard, her philosophical questions not seeking final answers, but maintaining the capacity for wonder that was itself the highest form of wisdom. Each person carrying their own small flame of understanding through the darkness, each contributing to something larger than themselves. The scrolls around him seemed less like burdens now, less like responsibilities that weighed upon his shoulders with their demand for preservation and protection. They were more like old friends keeping him company, their papyrus surfaces catching the lamplight and seeming to breathe with the accumulated presence of all the hands that had touched them, all the eyes that had read them, all the minds that had been changed by the words they contained. There was no urgency in his thoughts now, no desperate grasping after solutions to problems that had no solutions. The recognition came not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small, quiet moments of understanding that had been building throughout his 37 years in this place. His life's work had never really been about preserving scrolls, about maintaining catalogs, about organizing the vast collection that surrounded him. It had been about something more fundamental, more essential. It had been about tending to the quiet dignity of human curiosity itself. Dust motes drifted lazily through the golden light of the lamp, settling on the surfaces of scrolls and tablets with infinite gentleness, each particle a small reminder of time's passage, of the way all things eventually return to the earth from which they came. But the curiosity that had created these texts, the wonder that had driven scholars to ask questions and seek answers, to copy and preserve and share what they had learned, that was something different, something that could not be destroyed by flame or time or the rise and fall of civilizations. The stone walls of his chamber, worn smooth by decades of use, seemed to breathe with the invisible presence of all who had worked here before him. Scholars from Athens and Rhodes, from Memphis and Pergamon, from places whose names had been lost to history, but whose contributions lived on in the careful observations, the patient calculations, the thoughtful arguments that filled the scrolls around him. Each had brought their own flame of curiosity, their own dedication to understanding, their own small piece of the great puzzle that was human knowledge. Outside, the night air carried the faint scent of jasmine from the library gardens, mixing with the familiar smell of papyrus and ink that had become the essence of this place for him. The silence was complete, but not empty, filled instead with the invisible presence of countless words, countless thoughts, countless moments of human wonder preserved in this sacred space. Not preserved in the scrolls themselves, he understood now, but preserved in the act of preservation, in the love and care that had been shown to these ideas across generations. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. The political winds that had been gathering strength for months, the religious fervor that saw these texts not as treasures, but as threats, the economic pressures that made the library seem like an expensive luxury rather than a necessity. All of these forces were beyond his control, had always been beyond his control. But this moment, this quiet evening in his chamber, surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime's devotion, this was his to experience fully. He thought of his teacher, old Apollodorus, who had shown him how to handle papyrus without damaging it, how to organize texts so that future scholars could find what they needed, how to approach each scroll with the reverence due to something that contained human thought made permanent. The scrolls are not the knowledge, Apollodorus had told him once, late in the evening when they were working alone in the cataloging hall. The scrolls are just the vessels. The knowledge is in the attention we pay to them, in the care we show them, in the love we bring to the act of preservation itself. At the time, Demetrius had thought this was merely the philosophical musing of an old man grown sentimental about his work. Now, sitting in the lamplight with his hands folded peacefully in his lap, he understood that Apollodorus had been trying to tell him something essential about the nature of their calling. The true library was not this building, magnificent as it was. The true library was not even the collection of scrolls and tablets and maps that filled these halls. The true library was the quality of attention that scholars brought to their work, the devotion that scribes showed to their copying, the wonder that philosophers maintained in the face of life's mysteries. And that library, that true library, could not be destroyed by any flame. The lamp beside him flickered once, twice, then settled back into its steady rhythm. Demetrius closed his eyes and felt the weight of understanding settle over him like a familiar blanket. His hands, which had touched thousands of scrolls, which had carefully catalogued and organized and preserved so much of human knowledge, rested quietly in his lap. There was nothing more for them to do tonight, nothing more for him to accomplish or preserve or protect. He had served something greater than himself, had been part of a tradition that stretched back centuries and would continue in ways he could not foresee long after these walls had crumbled to dust. The flame of curiosity that had brought him to this place, that had sustained him through decades of patient work, that had connected him to scholars across time and space. That flame would continue to burn in other hearts, in other places, kindled by the same wonder that had always driven human beings to ask questions and seek answers and share what they had learned. In that understanding, Demetrius found a peace deeper than any he had ever known, a quiet acceptance that would carry him gently through whatever remained of this final night in the place he had served with such devotion for so many years. The scriptorium stretched before Thalia in the gentle lamplight, vast and peaceful in its emptiness, the wooden writing desks arranged in precise rows like an army of scholars at rest. She moved through her evening ritual with a new quality of presence, each gesture deliberate and complete, understanding now that these familiar actions were themselves a form of completion, a way of honoring the work that had filled her days and given shape to her life. She cleaned each reed pen with the same precision her teacher in Athens had shown her years ago, holding each one up to the light to ensure no trace of ink remained to harden and ruin the delicate tip. The ritual had become second nature over the years, but tonight she performed it with conscious gratitude, feeling the smooth surface of the reed between her fingers, appreciating the simple technology that had allowed human thoughts to be transferred from mind to papyrus across centuries. The astronomical treatise she had been copying lay finished beside her, the ink still slightly damp on the final page where she had written the colophon that identified her as the scribe and recorded the date of completion. The text described the movements of planets and stars, the calculations that allowed scholars to predict eclipses and chart the passage of seasons. But as she looked at it now, she saw something more fundamental, evidence of the human desire to understand, to find pattern and meaning in the apparent chaos of the natural world. She did not think about whether anyone would read these words tomorrow or in 100 years. That question, which had once filled her with anxiety about the permanence of her work, seemed irrelevant now. Instead, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work completed with love, each character formed with the devotion of someone who understood that the act of copying was itself a form of prayer, a way of participating in the great conversation between minds across centuries. The empty scriptorium around her held the invisible presence of all the scribes who had worked here before her, their dedication living on in the careful formation of each letter, each word, each preserved thought. She could almost see them at their desks, bent over their work in the same concentrated attention she had brought to her own copying, each one contributing their small part to the vast project of preserving human knowledge and understanding. She thought of her hands moving across countless pages over the years, of the way certain passages had made her pause in wonder at the beauty of an idea perfectly expressed, of the quiet joy she had found in the rhythm of careful work. The medical texts that had taught her about the intricate workings of the human body, the philosophical dialogues that had challenged her understanding of virtue and justice, the mathematical proofs that had revealed the elegant patterns underlying the apparent randomness of numbers, each had been a gift, an opportunity to participate in someone else's moment of discovery. The wooden writing desks, worn smooth by countless hands, seemed to glow in the gentle light of the oil lamps. She had sat at most of them over the years, moving from station to station as different projects required different materials or different angles of light. Each desk held memories. The morning she had finally mastered the difficult ligatures in a poetic text, the afternoon she had discovered an error in an earlier copy and spent hours researching the correct reading, the countless quiet hours when the only sounds were the scratch of reed on papyrus and the distant murmur of scholars discussing their work in other parts of the library. Scrolls lay neatly arranged on shelves throughout the scriptorium, their papyrus surfaces catching and reflecting the lamplight like small suns. Many of them bore her careful script, the product of years spent learning to form each letter with precision and beauty, to space words and lines so that the text would be easy to read, to create something that honored both the original author and the future readers who would encounter these ideas through her copying. The air was filled with the familiar scent of ink and parchment, mixed with the faint fragrance of the olive oil burning in the lamps. These smells had become the essence of home for her, more familiar and welcoming than the house where she slept, more meaningful than any other environment she had known. They spoke of work that mattered, of traditions that connected her to scribes in Alexandria and Athens, in Rome and Constantinople, wherever human beings had taken up reed and ink to preserve the thoughts of others. Through the high windows, the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, not yet light, but a lessening of darkness that spoke of morning's eventual arrival. She had worked through many such nights over the years, so absorbed in her copying that she lost track of time, looking up to find that hours had passed without her notice. But tonight was different. Tonight she was not racing to complete a text or struggling with a difficult passage. Tonight she was simply present with her work, with the tools of her trade, with the environment that had shaped and sustained her for so many years. The silence in the scriptorium was profound but comfortable, like the silence of a cathedral where prayers have been offered for generations. It was a silence that contained multitudes, all the words that had been copied here, all the thoughts that had been preserved, all the moments of concentration and dedication that had filled this space with purpose and meaning. She arranged her writing materials in their proper places, each item positioned exactly as it should be, ready for the next scribe who would work at this desk. The gesture felt ceremonial, a way of passing on not just the physical tools, but the tradition they represented, the understanding that this work was sacred, that each copy made was an act of love and preservation that connected past and future in an unbroken chain. She understood now that her anxious perfectionism of earlier years had been unnecessary, that the love and attention she brought to her work were more important than any individual mistake or imperfection. The texts she had copied would find their way to the readers who needed them, or they would not. But either way, she had fulfilled her part in the great project of human understanding. She had been faithful to the words entrusted to her care, had treated them with the respect they deserved, had added her own small flame to the great fire of knowledge that burned in this place. The astronomical treatise beside her seemed to pulse gently in the lamplight, its fresh ink catching the golden glow and seeming almost alive with the ideas it contained. She thought of the ancient scholar who had first made these observations, standing on a rooftop in some distant city, watching the stars wheel overhead and gradually discerning the patterns that allowed prediction and understanding. Then she thought of all the future readers who might encounter these same ideas through her careful copying, each one adding their own understanding to the great conversation that connected minds across time and space. There was no sadness in her thoughts as she prepared to leave the scriptorium for the final time, only gratitude for having been allowed to participate in this ancient tradition, for having spent her days in service to something larger than herself. The work would continue somehow, somewhere, carried forward by other hands and other hearts touched by the same devotion that had sustained her through years of patient copying. She extinguished the lamps one by one, watching each flame flutter and die, leaving the scriptorium in darkness, but not in emptiness. The desks and shelves, the scrolls and writing materials, all remained, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. And in that waiting, in that patient readiness, she saw a reflection of her own faith, that human curiosity and dedication were stronger than any force that might oppose them, that the love of knowledge would find a way to survive and flourish even in the darkest times. As she walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast space, Thalia carried with her the deep satisfaction of work completed with love, of a life spent in service to something eternal and beautiful and true. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the geographical collection chamber, casting geometric patterns across the floor, where shadows of window frames intersected with the organized arrangement of map cases that Marcus had spent years perfecting. He stood in the center of his domain, surrounded by the fruits of his methodical devotion, no longer working, but simply being present with the accumulated knowledge of the world's vastness that filled every surface and corner of this carefully ordered space. Maps covered the walls and filled the wooden cases, each one a testament to human curiosity about the world beyond the horizon, each representing countless hours of patient scholarship and careful attention to detail. The morning light illuminated the precise notations in his handwriting, the corrections and additions that marked years of cross-referencing accounts, verifying distances, updating coastlines as new information arrived from travelers and merchants who had ventured into unknown territories. He thought of all the travelers whose accounts he had preserved and organized with such care, all the merchants who had returned from distant lands with stories of strange customs and unfamiliar landscapes, all the explorers whose careful observations he had catalogued and integrated into the growing understanding of the world's true shape and extent. Each account had been a small gift, a piece of the great puzzle that was the inhabited earth, and he had been privileged to serve as the keeper of these gifts, the one who ensured they would not be lost or forgotten. The maps around him seemed less like static documents now and more like invitations to wonder, each line and symbol a reminder that the world was vast and full of mystery, that beyond every known coastline lay waters that had never been charted. Beyond every mountain range lay valleys that had never been described. His systematic approach to organizing this knowledge, which others had sometimes seen as mere pedantry, had always been motivated by something deeper, a profound respect for the courage and curiosity of those who had ventured into the unknown and returned with stories to tell. The air in the chamber was fresh with the scent of morning, mixed with the familiar smell of parchment and the cedar wood used to construct the storage cases that protected the maps from moisture and insects. These smells had become the backdrop of his daily life, as familiar and reassuring as the sound of his own breathing, as much a part of his identity as his name or the color of his eyes. Maps hung from wooden rods along the walls, their surfaces catching the light and revealing the careful detail of coastlines, mountain ranges, and river systems drawn by hands that had never seen these places but trusted the accounts of others. There was something beautiful about this act of faith, this willingness to create representations of distant lands based solely on the word of travelers, to believe in the existence of places that existed only in stories and descriptions until someone took the time to give them visual form. The stone floor, worn smooth by Marcus's daily rounds through the collection, reflected the gentle light and created a sense of space that extended beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber. He had walked these same paths thousands of times over the years, checking on the condition of the maps, updating his catalogs, ensuring that everything remained in its proper place and accessible to scholars who might need to consult specific geographical information for their research. But he understood now that his true work had never been about creating perfect records or maintaining flawless organization. It had been about preserving and nurturing a sense of wonder about the unknown, about maintaining the human capacity for curiosity about what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of home and daily life. The maps were not the territory, as he had learned from reading the philosophical texts in Helena's collection, but the love of understanding place and distance was itself a form of exploration, a way of traveling without leaving home. There was no urgency in his thoughts as he stood among his carefully organized treasures, no regret about projects left unfinished or improvements that might have been made. The system he had created would serve its purpose for as long as it was allowed to exist, and if that time was shorter than he had hoped, that did not diminish the value of the work itself or the satisfaction he had found in doing it well. He thought of the young scholars who had come to him over the years seeking information about trade routes or distances between cities, their faces bright with the excitement of planning journeys to places they had only heard described in stories. Some had returned years later with their own accounts to add to the collection, their travels having transformed them from seekers of information into sources of knowledge themselves. This cycle of curiosity and discovery, of questions leading to journeys leading to new questions, was perhaps the most beautiful aspect of his work. The chamber felt peaceful around him, not like a repository of facts and measurements, but like a temple to human curiosity, a sacred space dedicated to the proposition that the world was worth knowing and understanding. Each map, each carefully preserved account, each notation in his precise handwriting was an offering to this proposition, a small contribution to the great human project of making sense of the world and our place in it. He understood now that his methodical nature, which he had sometimes worried made him seem dull or unimaginative compared to the philosophers and mathematicians who worked in other parts of the library, had actually been perfectly suited to this particular form of service. The world's geographical knowledge needed someone who would approach it with patience and precision, who would take the time to verify and cross-reference and organize, who would treat each piece of information as valuable enough to deserve careful preservation. Through the windows, he could see the harbor where ships from all over the Mediterranean brought goods and passengers, and most importantly for his work, stories of distant places and unfamiliar peoples. The same harbor that had welcomed Herodotus when he came to research his histories, that had seen the arrival of scholars and travelers whose accounts now filled the cases around him. There was a continuity in this, a sense of participating in something larger than any individual life or career. The maps around him represented not just geographical knowledge, but human courage, the willingness to venture into the unknown despite the risks and uncertainties involved. Every coastline traced on papyrus represented someone's decision to sail beyond the familiar horizon. Every mountain range drawn in careful detail represented someone's determination to cross difficult terrain in search of what lay on the other side. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating more of the chamber and revealing the full extent of the collection he had spent his life organizing and preserving, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or reward. He had served something larger than himself, had been part of the great human conversation about the nature and extent of the world we inhabit. His systematic approach, his careful attention to detail, his methodical devotion to accuracy and completeness, all of these had been forms of love, ways of honoring the courage and curiosity of those who had ventured into the unknown and returned with knowledge to share. The geographical knowledge preserved in this chamber would outlive him, would outlive the building that housed it, would find new forms and new expressions as long as human beings remained curious about the world beyond their immediate experience. And in that continuation, in that endless cycle of question and exploration and discovery, his own small contribution would live on, not as a monument to his individual efforts, but as part of the great collaborative project of human understanding. Standing among his maps in the gentle morning light, Marcus found a peace that transcended any concern about the future, a quiet acceptance that came from knowing he had served faithfully and well, that his love of knowledge had been its own reward regardless of any external validation or recognition. The small garden courtyard adjacent to the library was awakening with the dawn, dewdrops on leaves catching and scattering the early light into tiny rainbows that danced and shifted with each gentle movement of air. Helena walked slowly among the plants and stone benches, her steps unhurried and deliberate, no longer seeking answers to the philosophical questions that had occupied her mind for so many years, but simply appreciating the questions themselves as companions that had shaped her life and understanding. Stone paths wound between beds of herbs and flowering plants, their surfaces still cool from the night, but beginning to warm in the strengthening sun. She had walked these same paths countless times over the years, usually while wrestling with some philosophical problem or trying to work through the implications of a text she had been studying. The garden had been her refuge during the most intense periods of intellectual struggle, a place where the rhythm of walking seemed to unlock new ways of thinking about old questions. But this morning was different. This morning she moved through the garden with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that the journey itself was the destination, that the search for wisdom was more valuable than any final answers she might discover. The Epicurean texts that had been her closest companions over the years seemed less like sources of doctrine now and more like invitations to a particular way of being in the world, a way that valued not pleasure as indulgence, but pleasure as the deep satisfaction that comes from paying attention to life as it unfolds. A small fountain in the center of the courtyard provided a gentle, constant sound of water moving over stone, a rhythm that had accompanied her thoughts for countless mornings and would continue long after she was gone. The sound was hypnotic and soothing, a reminder that some things persist through all the changes and upheavals that mark human history, that there is a continuity in the natural world that transcends the rise and fall of civilizations. The garden around her embodied the philosophy she had come to understand through years of study and reflection. Each plant grew according to its nature, reaching toward light and water without anxiety about the future or regret about the past. Each stone had been worn smooth by time and weather, shaped by forces larger than itself, but maintaining its essential character through all transformations. Each element contributed to a whole that was beautiful not because it was perfect, but because it was complete in its imperfection. The walls of the library rose around the garden, their stone surfaces softened by climbing vines that had grown here for decades, their leaves creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted throughout the day. She had often looked up at these walls during her walks, thinking about all the knowledge they contained, all the questions that had been asked and partially answered within their embrace. But now she saw them differently, not as containers of wisdom, but as witnesses to the human capacity for wonder, monuments to the endless curiosity that drove scholars to ask questions even when they knew the answers might remain elusive. Birds were beginning their morning songs, their calls echoing softly off the stone walls and creating a natural symphony that spoke of life continuing its ancient patterns, regardless of human concerns. There was something deeply comforting about this, about the way the natural world maintained its rhythms and cycles, independent of the political and social forces that seemed so urgent and overwhelming to human consciousness. She thought of all the questions that had occupied her mind over the years, all the philosophical problems she had wrestled with in the quiet hours of study, the nature of the good life, the relationship between pleasure and virtue, the question of whether the gods concern themselves with human affairs, the problem of how to live well in the face of mortality and uncertainty. Each had been a doorway into deeper understanding, not of final answers, but of the richness and complexity of human experience. The morning air was filled with the scent of jasmine and rosemary, mixed with the faint smell of papyrus and ink that drifted from the library windows. These aromas had become the essence of her daily life, markers of the environment where she had found her truest home, not in any building or city, but in the life of the mind, in the ongoing conversation between past and present thinkers who shared her commitment to understanding. She understood now that her years of study had not been about accumulating knowledge in the way that a merchant accumulates goods or a collector accumulates objects. They had been about cultivating a way of seeing that found meaning in the present moment, that appreciated questions as much as answers, that valued the process of inquiry as highly as any conclusions that might emerge from that process. The Epicurean emphasis on pleasure, which had initially attracted her because it seemed to offer a path away from the stern moralism of other philosophical schools, had revealed itself to be something much more subtle and profound. True pleasure was not the satisfaction of immediate desires, but the deep joy that comes from living in accordance with one's nature, from paying attention to the world with curiosity and appreciation, from maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. As she walked, Helena felt the weight of her philosophical training settling around her like a comfortable garment, something that had become so much a part of her that she no longer noticed it most of the time. The questions that had once seemed urgent and demanding now felt like old friends, familiar presences that enriched her experience without requiring immediate resolution. She had learned to live with uncertainty, to find comfort in the ongoing nature of philosophical inquiry rather than anxiety about its lack of definitive conclusions. The garden was fully awake now, filled with the sounds and scents and colors of morning, alive with the subtle movements of insects and birds going about their daily business. She paused beside a bench where she had often sat to read, running her hand along its sun-warmed stone surface, remembering the countless hours she had spent here with scrolls spread across her lap, lost in the ideas of thinkers who had grappled with the same fundamental questions that occupied every thoughtful human being. There was no sadness in her thoughts about leaving this place, only gratitude for having been allowed to spend her days in pursuit of wisdom, for having been part of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest philosophers, and would continue, she was certain, as long as human beings remained capable of wonder. The questions she had explored would outlive her, would be taken up by other minds in other times and places, would continue to offer their gifts of insight and understanding to anyone willing to approach them with patience and humility. The fountain continued its gentle music, the birds their morning songs, the plants their quiet growth toward light. In these simple, persistent realities, Helena found a peace that transcended any concern about the future of the library or the preservation of particular texts. The capacity for philosophical reflection was not dependent on any building or collection of scrolls. It lived in the human heart and mind, in the willingness to ask questions and sit quietly with uncertainty, in the courage to keep thinking even when thinking offered no easy answers. As the morning light grew stronger and the garden settled into the rhythms of another day, she found herself smiling at the recognition that philosophy was not about finding final answers, but about maintaining the capacity for wonder and questioning, about living fully in the present moment while remaining open to whatever insights might emerge from continued reflection and attention. In that understanding, she discovered a contentment she had never expected, a quiet acceptance that would carry her gently through whatever remained of this final morning in the place where she had learned to think. The morning light came slowly to Alexandria, creeping across the harbor waters like a careful hand drawing back a curtain. Costa stood in the great doorway of the library, his keys heavy in his palm, watching as the sun lifted itself above the horizon and began its ancient work of illuminating the world. Behind him, the corridors stretched into shadow and silence, holding within their depths the accumulated whispers of centuries, the dreams of scholars, the patient breathing of papyrus and parchment that had become his companions through so many nights of walking. He had completed his final round an hour before dawn, moving through the familiar passages with the measured pace that had become second nature to him over the years. The astronomy section where Demetrius worked with his star charts, the philosophy chambers where Lydia pursued her investigations into the nature of memory, the copying rooms where scribes bent over their delicate work of preservation, all of these spaces had become as familiar to him as the rooms of his own small dwelling near the harbor. More familiar, perhaps, for he had spent more hours in these halls than anywhere else, more nights listening to the particular silence that libraries hold, that quality of quiet that speaks not of emptiness, but of fullness, of thoughts settling like sediment in still water. The city below was beginning to stir, merchants preparing their stalls for the day's trade, fishermen returning with their nets full of silver fish, the eternal dance of human activity that had continued in this place since before the library's founding. The harbor sparkled in the early light, ships at anchor swaying gently with the morning breeze, their masts creating a forest of possibility against the brightening sky. From his position in the doorway, Costas could see the patterns of the city's awakening, the way light moved across rooftops and down narrow streets, illuminating the faces of early risers and catching in the spray from fountains in hidden courtyards. He thought of his younger self, the earnest student who had come to Alexandria with dreams of scholarly achievement, of making some significant contribution to the great conversation that had been continuing within these walls for generations. That young man had imagined himself bent over manuscripts, making discoveries, adding his voice to the chorus of learning that echoed through the library's chambers. When those dreams had proven too ambitious, when the rigors of advanced study had revealed themselves to be beyond his particular gifts, he had felt the sharp disappointment that comes when we must revise our understanding of our place in the world. But standing here now, with the morning light warming the stone beneath his feet and the familiar weight of responsibility settling around his shoulders like a comfortable cloak, he understood that there had been another kind of scholarship available to him all along, the scholarship of presence, of attention, of bearing witness to the daily miracle of human curiosity and dedication. How many nights had he paused outside the astronomy chamber to listen to Demetrius explaining the movements of celestial bodies to a small group of students, their voices hushed with wonder. How many times had he glimpsed Lydia in the philosophy section, her face illuminated by lamplight as she traced connections between ancient texts and contemporary questions, her fingers moving across papyrus with the delicacy of someone handling sacred objects. These moments of witnessing had accumulated over the years, creating their own form of learning, their own contribution to the great work that the library represented. He had been present for conversations that would never be recorded, for insights that flickered briefly in the minds of scholars before being refined and developed into the formal treatises that would survive in the collection. He had maintained the space where such thinking could occur, ensuring that the lamps remained lit, that the corridors remained safe, that the precious quiet of deep study remained undisturbed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the library's entrance and illuminating the carved stone columns that had welcomed so many seekers of knowledge. The craftsmanship in those columns spoke of its own form of devotion, the patient work of artists who had understood that beauty and learning were not separate pursuits, but different aspects of the same human impulse toward transcendence. The stone had been carved with images of scrolls and styluses, of figures bent in study and discussion, creating a visual poem about the life of the mind that had drawn scholars from across the known world. Birds circled overhead, their cries mixing with the distant sounds of the waking city. The scent of the sea mingled with the fragrance of the library's gardens, where herbs and flowers grew in careful arrangements designed to provide both beauty and practical materials for the preparation of inks and preservatives. Everything about this place had been conceived with intention, with the understanding that learning required not just books and scholars, but an entire environment that supported the delicate work of thinking and discovery. Costas remembered his first night as a guard, how nervous he had been about the responsibility, how inadequate he had felt walking through corridors lined with the wisdom of ages. He had worried that his presence was somehow inappropriate, that his abandoned studies marked him as unworthy to be the guardian of such treasures. But the library had taught him patience, had shown him through years of quiet service that there were many ways to honor knowledge, many forms that devotion could take. He had learned to read the moods of the building, to sense when scholars needed solitude and when they might welcome a brief conversation about practical matters. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to appear when someone needed a fresh lamp or had dropped a stylus in the darkness, and to remain invisible when deep concentration required absolute privacy. This skill had come not from any formal training, but from years of careful attention, from learning to listen not just with his ears, but with some deeper faculty that registered the rhythms of intellectual work. The morning light was growing stronger now, painting the city in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of the illuminated manuscripts he had sometimes been privileged to glimpse. Alexandria spread out below him like a living text, its streets and buildings forming patterns that spoke of human ambition and creativity, of the same impulse that had created the library and filled it with the accumulated wisdom of generations. The city and the library were part of the same story, he realized, different expressions of humanity's determination to preserve and build upon what had been learned, to create something larger and more enduring than any individual life. A group of early scholars was approaching up the steps, their faces bright with the anticipation of another day spent in pursuit of understanding. Costas recognized them all. Demetrius, with his star charts tucked under his arm, Lydia carrying a small basket of writing materials, several of the younger students whose enthusiasm reminded him of his own early days in the city. They nodded to him as they passed, these relationships built on years of shared presence in the sacred space of learning, and he felt the particular satisfaction that comes from being part of something larger than oneself. As they disappeared into the library's depths, Costas remained in the doorway, understanding that his vigil was not yet complete. The sun was fully risen now, but there would be other scholars arriving throughout the morning, other moments when his presence would be needed to maintain the delicate conditions that allowed intellectual work to flourish. His role was to be the constant element, the steady presence that provided continuity while brilliant minds pursued their various investigations into the nature of reality. He thought of all the knowledge contained within the building behind him, the thousands upon thousands of scrolls and codices that represented humanity's best attempts to understand everything from the movement of stars to the workings of the human heart. Mathematics and poetry, history and philosophy, medicine and astronomy, all of it gathered here in this one place, creating a concentration of learning unlike anything the world had ever seen. And he had been chosen to help protect it, to ensure that future generations would have access to this accumulated wisdom. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and distant lands, reminding him that the library's collection had been gathered from across the known world, that ships had arrived in Alexandria's port, carrying not just goods for trade, but scrolls and tablets containing the thoughts of distant peoples. The universality of human curiosity had created this place, the recognition that knowledge belonged not to any single culture or tradition, but to humanity as a whole. Standing there in the growing warmth of the morning sun, Costas felt a profound gratitude for the path his life had taken. His younger self's dreams of scholarly achievement had been replaced by something perhaps more valuable, the opportunity to serve learning in a different way, to be present for the daily miracle of human minds engaging with the deepest questions of existence. He had found his own form of scholarship, his own way of participating in the great conversation that the library existed to preserve and continue. The city below continued its ancient rhythms, merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets, the endless cycle of human activity that provided the context for the more rarefied pursuits that took place within the library's walls. Both were necessary, he understood. The practical business of daily life and the abstract investigations of scholars, the immediate needs of the body, and the eternal hunger of the mind. The library existed at the intersection of these different kinds of human necessity, providing a space where the urgent could be set aside in favor of the important, where time could be devoted to questions that had no immediate practical application, but whose answers might illuminate the very nature of existence. As the morning advanced and more scholars began to arrive, Costas prepared to step back from the doorway and begin another day of quiet service. But for these few moments longer, he allowed himself to simply stand and witness the beauty of the morning light on the ancient stones, the way the city spread out below like a living manuscript, the profound peace that came from understanding his place in the larger story of human learning and preservation. The sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, temple bells began their morning call, their bronze voices carrying across the rooftops like a blessing on the day's beginning. Costas smiled, feeling the familiar weight of his keys, the comfortable rhythm of responsibility settling around him like an old friend. In the growing warmth of the Egyptian morning, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the greatest library the world had ever known, he had found his own form of wisdom, his own way of serving the eternal human quest for understanding. And in that recognition, he discovered a peace deeper than any he had imagined possible, a quiet contentment that would carry him gently through whatever days remained. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.